Hi everybody, thank you for tuning in today. My name is Roland. I'm part of the Educate Ventures Research Limited team. As you all know, there is a waiting room as usual for each of our webinars. And whilst I'm doing this greeting, I'm also letting in everybody who is in the waiting room. So if you see me look away for a second, pausing my speech, then that is what I am doing. Just a reminder that you're all automatically muted when entering the room, and I will be switching any cameras in the audience off just so that none of us will be distracted from our lovely speakers who are here today. Today's webinar is the final one in our education reform series that Educate and its friends and colleagues began several months ago off the back of a joint statement on education reform that had been issued to the UK government. In the autumn, we'll be coming back with something different and new. Please follow us on social media or subscribe to our blog, the link to which I will post in the chat below to stay up to date with our events and our comms. Today, we'll be looking at the topic of data and what's come out of COVID-19 in education, whether it can point us in a direction beneficial to everybody in the education ecosystem. We have a great cast of stars who have kindly offered up their time and expertise to be with us this morning. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat. We will get to them if our panel has time. And now to give the panel as much time as possible to speak, I would hand over to Lord Jim Knight, who is, I think, just a little bit delayed, so I'm going to be emceeing just for the time being. I would ask that each of my lovely panelists introduce themselves, just tell us a tiny bit about who you are, what you do, in a kind of sort of extended Twitter length pitch. Tarek, I'm going to come to you first. Do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, hi, morning everyone. My name's Tarek Sasso and I'm the principal of a primary school in a small multi-academy trust down in the New Forest. And I'm really excited to be here today. I've been here at this school since I was IT lead and then previously deputy head. So I've been on a long journey with IT at the school. We're really well resourced now and have a really, really forward-thinking, innovative use of technology, which I'm really looking forward to speaking about today.
Thanks, Tarek. Timo, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, hi, I'm Timo Hannay. I'm founder of School Dash. We've existed for about 6 years now, and we use all kinds of data to help all kinds of people understand all kinds of things about the education system, particularly in England.
Thanks, Timo. Tom, do you want to take it away?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Tom Hooper, and I founded a business called Third Space Learning in 2013. And we provide online one-to-one maths tuition to children, predominantly in primary school. And we set up a model where we recruit maths tutors in India and Sri Lanka to make one-to-one tuition affordable, kind of and accessible within school budgets. We've worked with nearly 90,000 children at primary school. Over 50% of them are eligible for free school meals. So in terms of what we've done and pioneering that model, we've certainly had the social impact that we've always been aiming to. We're a part of the National Tutoring Programme this year and looking forward to next year and looking forward to today. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Caroline, would you like to introduce yourself?
Lovely, thank you. Hi, I'm Caroline Wright. I'm Director General of the British Educational Suppliers Association. So we work with more than 450 of the UK's leading educational suppliers. They cover everything from science, hands-on resources, educational furniture, textbooks, publishing resources, both digital and print, all the way through to some of the EdTech support services. I think the thing that unites all of those companies and why we work with 450, not several thousand, is because they all abide by an industry code of conduct and go through a series of checks before they become part of our trade association. And as part of that, we carry out research on what's happening in the education market in the UK, and we provide that information to our members to help inform and improve their educational products and services.
Wonderful. Thanks, Caroline. I suppose we've got a sort of, we've constructed a sort of small list of topics for the discussion today, and I'm just going to sort of dive straight in there, really, and I think start with yourself, Caroline. From your perspective, what do you think we have learned throughout the pandemic about sort of schools, about the technology that's being used, and that kind of stuff that can stimulate thinking on the ways to alter education so that it better meets the needs of society?
I think we've all learned sort of personally and in our day jobs, sort of a huge amount about what's been going on, about how education can support children, and how suppliers in particular can support the teachers and schools as they have dealt with the challenges of the last year. I mean, I know I've mentioned at a previous event with the first Educate report, but you know, the way that our sector stepped up to support schools was just phenomenal, from sort of the period of initial lockdown all the way through the past year. I mean, it's not a huge sector, and for suppliers to provide sort of products and services that totaled more than £36 million in just 3 months alone into the kind of British schools was just phenomenal. Even now, visa companies are providing COVID catch-up support and advice. We've got more than 50 companies sort of pledging free advice and support to schools. So I think for me, one of the key things we've seen over the past year is that ever closer relationship between suppliers and schools, and where it works really effectively to help support schools. So it's not just about selling products, it's about being there as part of the fabric of the education system. So a really positive working relationship. I think kind of one of the things I've seen though is that ironically, I think there are, over the next period, our sector faces more challenges in continuing to deliver the success than they ever have before. I think some of the challenges that have emerged and we're going to be facing over the next year are funding. We still have, you know, by the end of our research shows that by the end of 2021, we expect funding of the educational resources part of the sector to still be below 2015 levels. So to put that into context, this is the entirety of education supplies, not just EdTech, but about £37,000 in a primary school, 160,000 in a secondary school. So huge challenges, I think, for both existing suppliers that have developed those relationships with schools and new and emerging companies coming through in how do you reach schools, because we're seeing changes. The second sort of key theme I think we've seen is the change in procurement practices. We carried out research of 900 schools in December and January of this year on what are those procurement practices, and we're seeing significant changes that were adopted over the past year that are here to stay, including sort of primary schools and secondary schools. Virtually all schools will continue to limit sales visits, moving online to video calls. More than half of primary schools and 3/4 of secondary schools are looking to streamline the number of suppliers they use, and more are turning to websites, supplier websites to make choices, which is fantastic for suppliers. But the issue we'll have is sort of new and emerging companies into the market are going to find it ever harder to find schools to work with. So I think some of those challenges, plus combined with the international challenges of if we continue to see a decline for the next few years of the number of students moving for education into the UK, we will then be faced with increasing competition if English language continues to be the main sort of mode of teaching, but we will face increasing competition from, you know, Australia, America and others in terms of which supplies they use. So I think the culmination of all those three things makes the work of what Educate's doing even more important, because having that educational evidence to be able to show the value of an individual product and service is going to be hugely helpful moving forward in the future. And I also think from a sectoral point of view, it's intensely important, when I don't know the background to this and whether it's true or not, but if, you know, the media reports of the Chancellor and the Prime Minister coming head to head in terms of not agreeing on the education recovery plan and the amount that was asked for by Kevin Collins, because of a lack of evidence. I think it's sort of beholden on us as a sector to actually be able to show and provide that information and advice so that we don't find that happening again. So sorry if I've gone on a little bit, but that's sort of shaping my thinking over the last year.
No, that's fascinating. I think it's quite interesting talking about sort of you know, the companies finding it sort of harder and harder to sort of get into the sector because of the numerous sort of barriers, whether it's sort of oversaturation or language barriers and things like that, or possibly even barriers of sort of the efficacy of their actual intervention. I'm just wondering, I mean, for instance, Tarek, from your perspective, what, you know, what has worked that certain tech hasn't worked, that you've got sort of issues with, you know, with the way that companies are necessarily pitching themselves or trying to sort of start conversations with you? Can you tell us a little bit about how you've found the, you know, the sort of the dynamic with the tech industry?
I think the lockdown side of the tech industries has been, like, as Caroline said, it's been fantastic. Like what companies were able to offer, both in hardware and software, trials, just, you know, everyone was incredible. Perhaps maybe a little bit overwhelming for some schools to know which routes to go down. I think pre-lockdown, it was often, again, similar. There was often too much choice, or not a lot of forwards planning with schools. Like, I know personally that we have invested in some hardware which after 5 years would be completely out of date software wise, and you'd have to go and relook at your whole strategy. So, which is where we, you know, we're in a much better place now. But, you know, over the last 18 months, you couldn't really speak highly enough of the industry, what they offered to schools for free, the actual hardware that the government and other companies and local philanthropists were able to provide. I think the tough bit has come with the prices in the hardware now that have gone through the roof, and I think that's a serious concern for schools. Laptops are more expensive than they ever have been, so that's something that I think is, you know, the demand has gone through the roof. Schools are now using way more technology. Like, we already had ours planned in, so we have the technology in schools, but there will be schools, and I know of schools locally who, because of what they have learnt in the last 18 months, the skill set their teachers now have, the way that they can see technology can impact day to day and not just in a lockdown, schools are looking to invest more in technology, but the prices they're being quoted are, you know, it's double what it was this time 2 years ago. So I think those are some of the things that you would say the pros and cons of what happened over the most recent years.
Eric, and apologies everyone, I had it in my head that we were starting at 11:15, so apologies for being late. For an 11:15 start, I'm bang on time. And for those that don't know me, I'm Jim Knight, and I've just come from spending an hour and a half facilitating a discussion with the deputy heads for primary schools in Somerset. And what was interesting there was, you know, it was reassuring that they'd had all of their laptops from the government for their pupil premium kids, so that was great. And they'd had their data from their connectivity from the telecoms people that were giving it away to help. So that had all worked. And they had a sense, yeah, actually, we've now got the kit. I mean, we never had it before, and we got the appetite, and now we're permanently changing. You know, there's a workflow gain that we've got out of this, and a workload gain, as in there's slightly less work now that they are properly embedding the use of technology than the old ways of doing it, and that's going to be permanent. And they were quite excited about that. So I guess what you're saying is, because because the government's bought up all the laptops, the price has gone up. And for those schools that need to supplement that with buying some more, that's become a real issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, again, like, you can't really fault the government for what they were able to provide.
Oh, I can.
Oh, we can all fault the government, but you know, I'm still gobsmacked at the amount of tech they managed to get to schools. But if you know, if some schools have got like a taste for it, so you know, at our school we've got 230 people, premium children. We've got about 80 devices. Fortunately, we're really well resourced anyway. But for a school that maybe got a taste of some of the resources and thought, do you know what, we can now do this on a wide scale in teaching and learning, embed it in our practice. If they wanted to increase that number of devices and start making a 5-year rolling plan, like, that's going to be really hard to do now because everything is that much more expensive.
Let me just ask you one other quick question, just a small one. My sense, certainly from those deputy heads, was they've got a real appetite for change. They've learned a lot about less is more and focus, and they learned a lot from having some autonomy during the first lockdown, where they were kind of trusted with the key worker children and the vulnerables to just get on and teach what they thought was best and to do what they thought was best. And the carrot of autonomy, as one person described it, has been waved over them. Technology is a great enabler. Is it an enabler of change?
I think it is. I can't speak highly enough of. We've been supporting schools within our trust to use technology to change the way they are approaching teaching and learning, and lockdown or no lockdown, just children in school, the use of technology, and almost taking the skill set that teachers and leaders have acquired through being forced into technology through the lockdowns, and now carrying it on within their practice. It's what you said, Jim. It's all about embedding the practice. It's all about keeping it regular, not waiting for a lockdown and then pulling it back out, you know, and it's seeing the value of, like you said, the skills that teachers who may have been reluctant to engage with technology, just because I can teach without technology. Lots of people can teach without technology, but once they've seen the power of it and how it's not just a bolt-on or a fad or a gimmick, like, there are so many incredible tools to empower teaching and learning, to be more resourceful, to be more efficient. So yeah, I think it's an incredibly powerful tool for change.
Thanks. So Caroline, good morning. Always lovely to see you. Your members, obviously they will have acquired their, they'll know what's been used and what hasn't, and what products have worked well for them and what haven't. Do you get a sense that the successes are kind of reinforcing what works in the current constraints of our system, or are some of the successes ways of helping us move to a different, better school system?
Thank you. Sorry, I realised I did exactly what Roland told me not to do, which was to re-mute myself. So apologies for the delay. I think what we have seen is an acceleration over the last year. I think we were already at a point where schools that were technologically minded or had advocates in them were already at the point where they had an EdTech strategy for their institution and a plan. Now, as I sort of said just a moment ago, I think plans were, they would have liked to have been able to do more, but were budgetary constraints have always been a factor, but they had a plan for where they wanted to go. I think there are a number of schools that weren't able and still haven't been able to because of kind of broadband and infrastructure issues. I think they are still struggling to be able to implement technology as they might like. But I think over the last year, it did accelerate just taking schools. They had to look at how they could use technology. There was an injection, whatever we think of how speedy it was, how many devices. There was an ejection of hardware into schools, and I think the work that was done to kind of help rapidly tech up and CPD up teachers into being able to use that was phenomenal. And I think it's still early days, but I do hope, well, I think what's really needed is that schools are given the time now to be able to reflect and work out how that can continue to accelerate some of the positive changes that have been made and what have done. I think the real challenge will be if our schools are continually thrown into the next challenge or the next initiative. I think they really need some time for reflection. I think the discussions that are happening about the Baker clause and so on will be really important. Just give teachers and schools time to plan, to be able to reflect on what's worked well for them in their own situations. What's the feedback from their students and parental communities about how they're able to use technology at home and how that's worked out for them. So I think it's too early to say. It's a really crunch point, but I think we'll go backwards if we don't let schools reflect and give them the support for the schools that didn't have their own strategies, to give them time to develop those. But if they get that right, I think it's a huge opportunity to be able to use their resources more effectively. But I do also think that there is still the case it's a blended system. I don't think it should go forward as completely technology driven or go back to exactly the way it worked before. I think what we've learned is actually there's a time and a space for everything, but how does it fit in?
I want to bring in Timo and Tom, but I can't resist Yvonne's comment in the chat about pedagogy. Because, as Anna Pedrosa has said, EdTech can be an agent for change, or it can be deployed badly and everyone thinks it's all a bit shit. And if we just try and translate face-to-face pedagogy online, that'll always be less good than online pedagogy. So just back to you, Tarek. How do you respond to what Yvonne has said there? Are schools adapting pedagogy to what is now available? And if so, are they being constrained by it? Or have schools begun to adapt technology to the kind of pedagogy they find works in their context?
I think it's exactly, it is about context. We do try and adapt pedagogy, or what we know as effective pedagogy, and how tech can enhance that, I guess, is what I would say happens here and what we try to do. So like I said before, it's not just using it for the sake of using it. If not using technology is more effective, then don't use technology. But there are ever-growing tools within EdTech which can empower teachers, such as Sentry Techs. The way Sentry Tech provides like assessment and feedback and responsiveness is incredible. Even really basic, just from like flipped learning, really using technology there to allow children to rewatch inputs and get feedback. So it's
the joy of flipped is it's technically simple,
really simple,
but it's pedagogically different and quite sophisticated. Yeah, it's cool. Thank you. Right, now I need to bring in Tom and Timo. So, and in doing so, sort of move us to Carmel in the chat. Should there also be a policy level reflection? And I suppose that takes us to how to engage policymakers. I'm a recovering policymaker, politician type person, but I've been a bit engaged. I'm a bit of a freak. I've been engaged with this for quite a while. Tom, you've had some success in engaging DFE through this process. Can we engage them with technology as part of change, or are they only interested in technology according to a fairly rigid mindset about what works and what they want?
So we're learning about this now. We've been going for 8 years, and the first 7 years we were not engaged at a policy level at all, frankly. We were, I think it was definitely the right decision, very focused on our schools, each and every individual school. And whilst what we do is is very dependent on the technology we build and develop, we always kind of push that to the back, because schools don't care about technology per se. They care about the solution, the problem they've got, and can you clearly articulate and deliver a solution to that. Clearly, everything's changed this last year with the National Tutoring Programme and the DFE, and kind of what that's done for, certainly for what, in terms of what we do, tutoring, and the policy changes around that. So frankly, we're still trying to feel our way through that at the moment. Broadly, I think it's a very good thing. You know, it was certainly, the National Tutoring Programme, I think quite unfairly took a lot of stick. I think it was an incredibly bold move, and certainly looking at the reaction of other countries around the world to the speed and kind of volume which the government committed to. I think it received a lot of plaudits for that. And the operational challenges of it were that's what comes with being bold and quick, particularly in the midst of crisis. So I kind of personally, I applaud certainly applaud the EEF, who I think did a cracking job with it. In terms of the DFE, we actually don't have, we interact with the National Tutoring Programme, the Education Endowment Foundation, Nesta, Impetus. So we don't actually interact with the DFE too much. I think from our point of view, what we certainly see is, from a school's point of view, which is obviously how we have to come at everything, they are quite understandably wary of prescriptive direction, from centralized prescriptive direction. And certainly there's a lot of schools that we speak to, and I think this comes through in a lot of the teacher forums as well. Again, I'm talking about the NTP, that they would far rather have access to tutoring that was had more freedom around it. I think that also then supports more innovation for providers and schools to work together to come up with the best solutions for that school or for that type of school. So I suppose we need to try and figure out is, what is the balance between a Department for Education that can provide more resourcing and more support for schools and providers, whilst maintaining the clear requirements on quality and safeguarding, and yet allowing room for innovation and solutions that are fit for purpose for the real and very busy and demanding needs of people.
So an enabling department rather than a controlling one.
Yes.
And then tell me, with the work that you've done on NTP, I assume that there's then a bunch of data that is generated in terms of the interactions and where they are and what's worked and what's been less successful, and possible to then overlay different sorts of students where what's worked has been different, and so on and so forth. Is that being captured, and who's looking at it?
Yeah, and that's, as an online provider, it's a lot easier for us to, I mean, that's every single interaction that happens, we capture that. And we, over years, have been using that to try and understand, where are we doing a good job, where are we doing a bad job, and trying to be better. So it's easier for us to share that with the Department for Education or with the NTP. And I think it's important to recognize that whilst we're online, that a lot of key parts of the NTP are quite rightly face-to-face in school. And it's important for the government and for all of us, frankly, to better understand, have an easy way of capturing information around the different types of tutoring, so we can understand, is this money being spent well? As an industry, if we're going to make tutoring a central part of how we help close the attainment gap, which is what third space learning is all about and has been for 8 years, you know, that investment, if it is to become mainstream, has to be justified, and it has to be justified on evidence. So we, as much as I talk about being an enabler rather than a controller, there is a level of control that is important if that information is to be captured and if that evidence is to be proven or not, perhaps. But I think we as providers need to accept that, and indeed encourage it and embrace it.
What's really interesting about what you say, Tom, is that obviously online use of technology just captures data by its very essence.
Yeah.
Those Somerset heads, deputy heads, when I asked them about what they would keep in the future, none of them mentioned the Oak National Academy and none of them mentioned tutoring. Lots of mentions of forest schooling, lots of mentions of enrichment that is not going to be captured so easily in terms of data.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of tricky thing there about how we objectively analyze these things. Timo, you're probably as much of an expert on education data as anyone I know anywhere in the world. So how do we deal with that? How do we get the right perspective, and how do we ensure that the right data science skills are at a policy making level?
Thanks for bigging me up, Jim. That's a really nice intro. I mean, there's a few different points there. So one thing to say is that I think certainly my experience during the pandemic has been both a greater availability of data, partly because of exactly what you said, that schools and pupils are making greater use of online resources because they have to, but also a greater willingness of the people running those different services to share their data and allow it to be analysed to draw insights. Not least because it's seen as something of a national emergency that we need to understand the situation and be able to mitigate the fact that pupils have been falling behind in various ways. So I think there's been a sort of, from my point of view as a data geek and a data analyst, I think there's been a huge win in terms of, you know, the development of our skills and our understanding of what we can learn through the availability of this data, including at the policy level. And so, you know, there's never been more interest from government and other sort of national organisations. So, you know, the Department of Education, Number 10, Ofqual, you know, as well as other, you know, policy-oriented organisations like Education Policy Institute and EEF that we heard about earlier as well, have just been like, you know, all over this stuff. And there's been, you know, more discussion and more analysis and more engagement from people really at the policy end than I've ever seen before. I don't think, so I think it's important that people at the policy end are familiar with how these analyses work and how to interpret them. I don't think it's necessarily important that they can conduct them themselves. I mean, I would say that because School Dash, my business, does this kind of analysis. And so and it's been actually a really informative and really productive relationship, I think, during the course of the pandemic, in terms of us speaking with people who have data, running the numbers and trying to draw in, you know, useful, actionable insights out of them, and then, you know, discussing them with policymakers and indeed with schools and trusts and others who can actually make a difference. I do just want to pick up on one other thing that you alluded to there as well, which is that, you know, the data, you know, we're necessarily analysing the data that we have available, and there's all kinds of things in which we don't have data. And you mentioned sort of forest schools, you know, and, you know, it comes up very frequently. You know, extracurricular activities is something that people want to know a lot about, and there's just no data on it. There's certainly no good, consistent national data. And so I think we are, you know, people like me, but all of us, I think, you know, we have to be alert to the risk that we're like the proverbial drunk looking for his keys under the lamppost because that's where the light is, as opposed to, and therefore we sort of privilege, we treat as important the things that we can measure, simply because we can measure them. And I think it's incredibly important we don't do that. And I hope that I'm continually alert to that. But the reality is we can't analyze, at least in the way that I analyze things, we can't analyze things where we don't have the data. I would say that the other thing that the pandemic has accelerated, in my view, is the availability on some things, the data on some things that we do care about where we previously had very poor data. So, for example, you know, we did a project together with Educate, which is an edtech startup that does pupil wellbeing surveys. And early on in the pandemic, so last spring, summer, we did a kind of a national analysis of pupil wellbeing based on a free survey that they'd set up online to help schools during the initial lockdown. And that to me is a good example of something that was, you know, it was up and running really quickly. Their expertise was wellbeing surveys. Our expertise was doing kind of national level analysis and drawing out the insights. And, you know, within a few weeks, we had data from many, many thousands of pupils across the country and we're able to sort of say what the patterns were and to draw out some implications from that. And I think that kind of thing, you know, has been moving forward. And I think we learn how to do that now.
And that's exciting and really encouraging. And I guess, I was going to ask about health data for children, and how much of it there is and how useful it is. And with something like that well-being work that you've done, are policymakers then as interested in that as you are, kind of thing? Yeah. Because I guess there's if I were to unfairly characterize my friends who are ministers at the DFE, I'd say they know what they want to measure and they measure that, and that's all they really care about. And someone coming up with a really insightful picture of an inconvenient truth, they might not necessarily listen to.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I'm just going to, in the chat, I'm just going to post a link to the wellbeing work that we did, just in case anyone wants to have a look at it. So there's definitely, we've also done a lot of work on attainment, particularly primary attainment. So with RS Assessment, part of HODA, they run, they run tests, across thousands of schools in the country. And our work with them long predates the pandemic, but we've done more intensive work during the pandemic to look at the learning loss and the catch up as schools have closed and reopened. And I'd say that at the policy level, my experience so far is there's definitely been more interest in the attainment data than in the wellbeing data. That's my perspective. I mean, frankly, they're all over the attainment data. There's intense interest in it, and we've been generating almost in real time. And I think that's predictable. Whether it's justified or not is a different question. I think that is predictable. I hope that's going to start to change. I think, I mean, the reality is, so I'm giving a talk together with Laura McInerney from Teacher Tap to government next week, actually, under the auspices of the Open Innovation Team at the Cabinet Office. So if you ask me this time next week, I might have an idea whether we can get them interested in the wellbeing data. You know, Laura and I have worked together on teacher recruitment data, understanding teacher recruitment activity during the pandemic as well. Her through surveys, Teacher Tap through surveys, and we have the recruitment data through school websites. So there's that kind of stuff that, that isn't usually tracked and analysed, but has become super important during the pandemic, because that market was very disrupted, and similarly for people well-being. So I hope that we can get greater interest, but you're right. I mean, that the current policy interest is mostly on the traditional stuff like attainment.
And I love Yvonne. She's asking really good questions in the chat. She's saying, is there a false dichotomy between well-being and attainment? So I just a sort of, do you quickly in the data, do you see any kind of evidence around saying there are blockages to attainment that are related to health and well-being? And it's only when we pay attention to the health and well-being data that we can then free up the learning to then impact the attainment data.
So, I mean, here to us, I'm speaking more as a dad than as a data analyst. I mean, I think they're both important, but if I were going to prioritize one over the other, I'd prioritize the well-being of my kids over the academic attainment of my kids for sure. I want them to be both happy and healthy, and academically successful in whatever in whatever way we want to define that in the case of the particular kid. As a data analyst, I'll just say, actually, I wish I could say otherwise, but the small amount of analysis we've done on it is actually self-reported well-being is to some degree negatively correlated with academic attainment. So if you look at places like London, for example, and particularly London sort of ethnic minority communities, you find self-reported well-being in adults and kids actually to be quite low, relatively speaking, but academic attainment of the kids to be extremely high. So so there's a complex relationship between self-reported.
So doing well in tests doesn't necessarily make you happy and healthy.
Exactly. I think you can draw a conclusion around being very, very kind of ambitious and driven doesn't necessarily make you happy. It may get good grades. So at some level there's a balance to be struck between those two things, but at some level clearly they support one another. I mean, you're not going to do well if you're not happy and healthy to some degree, for sure.
I better move on. Time marches on. Tarek, let me come back. Oh, Caroline, you come in.
It just seems, if you don't mind, just an amazing opportunity. If we've got Timo being our champion in government next week, being able to talk to some of the decision makers, it's just kind of a real plea. I remember when Jim's time in government, there was you know, the Department for Education was renamed the Department for Children, Schools and Families, precisely because of that realisation that actually, unless you look at the whole child across all the different bits of government that impact on that child, you're never really going to develop policy that has a holistic approach. And some of those, I think what I'm really struck by is the pressures, to be fair to the civil servants and so on, the pressures they're having of trying to deliver their department, whichever department they're in, their policy objectives. There's not a holistic measure of, well, what does that point about data and what does success look like? And, you know, you could measure it in terms of the wellbeing, childhood referral to CAMS and so on. So actually, and what's the cost to society of not getting all of that right? And there just isn't that. Departments look in their single policy levers of what they control within their department. So if you could make that point of getting that bigger picture and looking at the well-being, looking at sort of, you know, end career destinations in the long term, the benefits to business and so on, not just on those, I know I'm preaching to the converted, but it's wonderful that you're there being able to champion us. Thank you.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, and Tom, you put a hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's also a factor in terms of the age of the child as well. I think the younger the child, often the more important it is to focus on confidence and curiosity as the kind of long-term driver of attainment. Certainly, if I look at the children, we work with about 20,000 children a week across 1,300 primary schools, and so we're speaking to the teachers there, you know, hundreds of teachers every week, and you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, about 50% of our children from disadvantaged backgrounds, often confidence is a massive barrier. And that's the kind of primary goal from the teacher and for us and a lot of the training we give the tutors. And when they judge us, when we talk about data, it's less, of course, attainment data is important, but there's also the qualitative data, which is so much richer and more important of the teacher's observation. So when we're talking to them about has it worked and kind of how will you use third space in the future, so much of it is about, is the child asking more questions in class? Is the child putting their hand up in class? And I think that particularly at a kind of key stage 2 level is so important. And it may sound like an obvious point, but it's such a rich seam of data and information that we should never lose sight of by focusing too much on the kind of quantitative components that are easier to measure.
I
once had a slightly pedestal like that.
I once had a geeky conversation, not with Timo in this particular occasion, but with someone who was doing interesting work and had to kind of capture qualitative data and then be able to analyze it by, there's some interesting keyword stuff that they were doing. So it was kind of fun and interesting. So Tarek, what's your reaction, I guess, to this potential conflict, or this relationship between what we measure and where the data is and that we can evidence, and then the wider children's outcomes? And are there things that we could be analyzing that you capture in schools that we just don't value enough to collect, that could help us with a more balanced analysis of the data to see how our children are and whether or not we can improve the childhood? Can schools be a place that really nurtures childhood rather than just nurturing learning?
I think there are schools that are doing that already. It's just not what is gathered by politicians. I go out and say what maybe they say is what is important, or what maybe a parent would. Well, actually, do you know what? As a parent, if I could measure a school on the well-being of the pupils, I'd want to know that information. I'm sure everyone else would. There are tools out there which you can do that with. Lots of different tools. We do an assessment called a Thrive assessment on all of our children, which measures their well-being, their social emotional development, as previously mentioned.
And do parents want that? Do they? If a parent says, "Oh, I want to know how well my child is doing in maths relative to another child of their age, or children generally of their age," are they also interested in how, on the well-being of their child, however, whether we use that word or not, relative to others like them.
Sometimes I would say parents who maybe, for lack of a better word, are more old school, or they went to school and that's their view of what school is, perhaps aren't interested in that. But a school who maybe a parent who maybe understands their child, or wants their child to have a really healthy well-being, may be really interested when we say, do you know what, we're going to put these things in place to help with your child's happiness, their development. I think like I think Tom said, especially in our infant years, is really focusing on self-esteem, confidence. I mean, you say you focus on the infant years, but it stands out and it slaps you in the face older if they don't have that, and then you've got to put in more intervention. But we do measure it as a trust. I've just got to submit that data now. We compare that across schools. We compare how many children's services referrals we've done. We compare how many CAMS referrals they've done. So no, that's not.
And I guess if all parents had been obeying the law during lockdown in respect of bubbles, then we'd be really worried about social skills and sociability, especially for those younger infant kids. And we'd be trying to measure that, and parents would be quite worried because of the anxiety levels and so on for their kids, and wanting help to get that fixed.
Yeah, I think they were. It came to a time where, I can speak really frankly about my school, where we perhaps didn't focus on well-being quick enough. And like it was maybe like a few weeks into it where we, there was all of the like, how many hours should a year 3 be taught online? How many hours should a key stage year 6 be taught online? And actually, after a while, we just said, hang on a minute. We need to speak to the children, we speak to the parents, our elders are speaking to the children. We need to balance this. And parents understood that. And if anything, it made it really clear for some of those parents who were possibly more academic focused in outcomes, that actually school is about developing the whole child and a holistic approach. And you can't learn if you're mentally not in the right place, or you're not happy, or you're feeling anxiety or stress. So that is a benefit from it, because parents are now more on board with that, I would say.
I was inspired this morning by a head teacher, a deputy head, who said that they decided to double the length of their playtimes from 15 minutes to just over half an hour, with a bit of reflection at the end about what they got out of their playtime. And as a result, the kids were concentrating better and more on task when they were learning, and that they were therefore going to keep much longer playtimes. This is great. Timo, you got your hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a really quick comment about what you and Tariq were just discussing now. I mean, one of the important things I think about data collection is that central government, I think quite rightly, doesn't, is I think always interested in collecting more data, but doesn't want to impose more and more onerous constraints on schools, put loads more workload on schools and teachers and pupils. And I think one of the amazing things about what we've been able to do with edtech companies and others like RS Assessment is we're making use of data that already exists. I mean, it's sort of the point that you were making earlier on, that this is a byproduct of the things they're already doing. And so I think one of the really important things, if we're thinking about, like I do, collecting and analysing loads and loads and loads of data and trying to analyse everything we possibly can to try and understand it better, we need to do that in a way that's realistic about what it imposes on schools and teachers. And the wonderful thing about making use of the kind of data that we've been talking about is that it already exists. So there's no extra, onerous constraints on schools.
Yeah. So I want to pick that up with you, Caroline, and then Timo, I'm going to come back to you because there's a sort of almost a parallel discussion going on in the chat about the workforce. So knowing all the analysis you do on workforce, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. But Caroline, just picking up on what Timo was just talking about, amongst your members and in the sort of the edtech commercial world, they're capturing lots of data. Some of that's proprietarial, and they're going to hang on to that. But is there more that we could do to get some of that data open sourced and published so that we can analyze it more, and that Timo is happy doing his magic thing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think individual suppliers are sharing and doing that kind of thing with their own schools in their communities. So I think it's happening, but probably not so much at a wider sort of system sharing the information across companies and amalgamating that data up. So I think there's definitely a conversation about how that could be done. I think, and companies, like I say, are very happy to do it within their own communities. I think we've got a real challenge ahead, given some of the anxieties of what's been happening in the education system over the last couple of years. I think there is a willingness to collaborate, but I think there's also a fear of how involved, particularly with a government that might want to use data for particular means, of how much could be shared. So I do think there's a need for an honest discussion for schools to feel comfortable for that data to, even if it's anonymized, to be shared, and also for commercial suppliers to do that without feeling and having the trust. I think there's a period of time where we need to rebuild trust, whether or not it's right that there isn't the trust there, or whether it's very sensible that the trust isn't there. I think there's a period of time where I think government needs to develop the vision first, and then be able to articulate how different parts of our sector, whether that's schools, whether it's the commercial suppliers, whether it's others, parents and so on, what's the role in achieving that vision? And I don't think we've got the vision yet. I think we need to work together to inform what that could be. But I think the fear is of having more and more initiative-itis on to do particular policies. And I think we need a big vision to be able to actually work out how we should be using data in that way.
Yeah, and I guess we've got this controversy about NHS data, and the government's not necessarily going to want to open another controversy about children's data captured through schools, and there's some caution that's going to be there. Tim, I said I would come back because of this side issue that's being chatted about around the workforce. Are we doing much around data on workforce well-being, and is it being captured, and is anybody listening to the evidence?
Yeah, so I've only been able to sort of skim read all the comments coming in thick and fast, but as Katie mentioned, there are some people. She mentioned Adurio as a company that's doing staff wellbeing surveys as well as pupil wellbeing surveys, and we know them well. As far as I'm aware, there's no. So that's obviously done on a commercial basis where the schools that want to sign up for the surveys can sign up for them and use them. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing done, nationally in a consistent manner. I mean, most of the staff data comes from the annual staff, the workforce census, which normally takes place in November, and we get it sort of early the following year, certainly in a normal year anyway. That has useful data, but I think there are parallels with what we've been talking about with regard to the data about kids, where we get lots of attainment data and ethnicity data and things like that, but we don't necessarily get data on things like well-being or extracurricular activities or other things that we might be interested in. And the staff data is rather similar. We get lots of data around age ranges and ethnicity and different salary grades and vacancy rates, which isn't terribly useful in November because schools tend to be fully staffed anyway. But we don't get data through that on well-being. Things like staff turnover. We get sickness absence data, which at least statistically does correlate with things like Ofsted rating and things like that. So you can arguably use that as something of a proxy for sort of morale or something like that, but it's a bit tricky. So the short answer is no, not really. We don't have that kind of data.
And OECD do their TALIS survey about once every 4 years, which does ask some of those questions, and maybe we could learn from that. Tom, I guess from your point of view, you said you're talking every day, every week to lots and lots of teachers. Do you get a sense from that sort of qualitative engagement around their well-being? And with the tutoring work, do you get the sense of okay, this is a relief for me because I've got someone taking some of the burden away, and this is good for my well-being?
On the former, I'm I'm always amazed by the resilience and cheer of teachers, frankly, when we speak to them. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. It's an obvious statement to make, but it's extraordinary the pressure they've been under, and like both pressure multiplied by uncertainty. So I'm amazed by how, I'm amazed by their resilience and how they've conducted themselves through this. I mean, clearly, I hope that Third Space, and hopefully that reflects your second question, or my answer to your second question, which is, I certainly hope Third Space is viewed as a really good support service for teachers. That's what it's designed to be. From the very beginning, it was designed to allow teachers to direct our tutors to target learning gaps as they arise in class. Reinforcing their class teaching strategy. So the user experience, the workflows, everything was built around the teacher to try and, I mean, in my basic words, make it as easy and accurate for teachers to deploy in support of their work.
And could we?
I hope so. Yeah,
we're almost out of time. But if we wanted to value well-being, mental health as much as we value how well people are doing in English and maths, could we set up essentially the equivalent in terms of an online capability in terms of access to school nursing or ed psychs or whatever? Is there an opportunity there?
So I think, and what works for children's social care, we're piloting something where they were putting social workers in schools. I think Place to Be does something very similar. And the third point I was thinking about, I know there was a trial where they taught philosophy at primary school, which kind of helped with both academic outcomes, but I think also well-being in terms of kind of engagement, enjoyment. So I think there's a lot to be said for providing kind of human teaching interactions that are focused on the kind of wider well-being, curiosity and confidence of children. I think clearly that would have a big benefit on overall well-being and indeed on attainment as an kind of future and longer term output of that.
Listen, we're out of time. Some of you have got to go at midday. So thank you so much. I could have gone on and on, especially if I'd been on time. We'd have had more time. But it's been great. And I'm really grateful. I hope everyone has got something interesting out of it. The chat was also equally great. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again. This is the last one for a while. There'll be something new and joyful in the autumn. We don't know what yet, but see you again soon. Thank you. Over to you, Ron.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. I'll let you
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Everybody have
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.